tractor parts, and today we're going to show you how to change the clutch on this little Yanmar tractor. Now today we're working on a YM1510, but Yanmar has used the same clutch style on pretty much all of their models, so even if you don't have a 1510, most of these steps will still be the same. The first thing you're going to want to do before you get started is head over to our website, hoytractor.com, and make sure you have all of the parts you need for the job. Just click on Parts, your tractor model number, and then the category of the part that you need. We've got thousands of parts in stock, most orders ship the same day, and we always have free tech support. To get to the clutch, we're going to need to split the engine from the bell housing. Now fortunately, that's only held together by a few bolts, but unfortunately there's a lot of other stuff we have to get out of the way first. The main problem we have is that the steering gearbox is bolted to one half, and it goes up through a hole in the cowling which is bolted to the other half. The first thing we need to do is pull the steering wheel off. Now you'll need a good puller, and you can rent those at most local auto parts stores if you don't have one. Getting this steering wheel off ended up being kind of a battle, as you can probably see. It went a long time without a cap, so the splines and the threads were badly rusted. But now the steering wheel is off, the cowling bolts are off, so now it's just a matter of getting the wires loose and getting the cowling pulled out of the way. So now you really have a couple options. You can either remove the drag rod from the pitman arm and leave the steering gearbox in place, or you can go ahead and unbolt the whole steering box and leave all of those linkages connected. I personally think it's easier just to remove the steering gearbox, so that's what I'm going to do here. I did end up removing the fuel tank because on this model there's a couple bolts that go into the steering box that are hidden under the tank. I went ahead and removed the fuel tank tray just so we could see what we were doing. But basically 4 bolts holds the steering gearbox down and then it's out of the way. Since we are splitting the tractor in half, you'll need to use a couple jack stands on both ends of the front half of the tractor. This half of the tractor is going to stay stationary, and we're going to roll the back half away from it. You'll want to put something on both sides of both tires so they can't roll. And also wedge a board between the front axle and the frame rail so that it doesn't tip whenever you separate the two halves. And since we're going to be rolling the back half of the tractor away, we'll need to support it on a rolling floor jack. So now we need to separate anything that joins the front half of the tractor to the back half of the tractor. On this model, all there really is hydraulic lines, so we need to get those unbolted. We also need to keep an eye on these lines when we start separating the two halves and make sure they don't get hung on anything. And now we're ready to start unbolting the two halves. Depending on the tractor model, there's usually 5 to 8 bolts that hold these two halves together. You'll want to make sure there's some tension on your floor jack, but not so much that you're actually lifting anything. The goal here is just to be able to remove the bolts and pull the rear half straight back. You can see here how I have a little bit more gap at the top than I do at the bottom. I really have the floor jack just a little too high. I should have let it down just a little bit. Just put a screwdriver or a little pry bar in between the gap and just gradually pry the two halves apart. It's nice to have a helper at this step. They can grab on the rear of the tractor and just gently pull backwards. You just don't want to pull hard enough that you pull the front half off the jack stands. If it seems like it's binding or it's hard to separate, you may want to get a tape measure and make sure you have the same gap at the top as you do at the bottom. You may need to adjust your jack up or down, just so things aren't in a bind. And also be sure to keep an eye on your hydraulic lines, make sure they're not hanging up on something. Now sometimes when you split the tractor, the shaft will stay with the front half of the tractor, sometimes it'll stay at the rear half. Go ahead and pull it out either way, we need to take a look at it later. And now we can unbolt the pressure plate from the flywheel. Sometimes you may need a pry bar, and sometimes the pressure plate will almost fall off. And now is a good time to take a look at your flywheel. You want to make sure it's nice and smooth without a bunch of grooves or rust on it. This one here looks just fine, so we're going to leave it alone. And now we're going to pull out the throwout bearing carrier. And now's a good time to take a look at our old parts to see what needs to be replaced. You're generally going to want to replace the clutch disc, the pressure plate, and the throwout bearing while you've gone this far. Sometimes you'll also want to replace the pilot bushing if it looks like it has a lot of wear. Our old clutch disc is really in pretty good shape, but most people go ahead and replace the disc no matter what. Unless you're on a really tight budget, it's not worth putting back old parts and having to worry about doing this again later. The same thing goes for the throwout bearing. It spins really nice and it sounds nice and smooth, but we're going to go ahead and replace it since we're this far. And now we need to check out the condition of the clutch shaft. You need to check out the splines on both ends and also the area that goes into the pilot bushing. And also take a good look at the coupler. You want to make sure it fits nice and tight on the splines. And this is the pilot bushing. It's pressed up into the end of your crankshaft or into your flywheel. Now you don't always have to replace your pilot bushing, and it's kind of hard to get out. If you slide your shaft into the pilot bushing and everything feels tight, I would just leave it. You also need to check the condition of the splines at the front of the transmission. And now we can start putting everything back together. You'll notice the clutch disc is not the same on both sides. You'll want the side that sticks out the furthest to go towards the back of the tractor. And then you'll use the clutch shaft to line up the clutch disc and help hold it in place. And then slide on the pressure plate. Some models might have dowel pins to help you line up the pressure plate, and sometimes you might have to use a rubber hammer to help tap it on. Then just start your bolts and barely tighten them up. The goal here is just to put a little friction on the clutch disc so it stays in place. And now we want to make sure that our clutch shaft is as level and straight as we can get it. This will make it easier to spline the two halves of the tractor back together. And then you can finish tightening the bolts. I'll tighten them with an electric impact, and then I'll come back through with a torque wrench. And now we're going to remove the old throwout bearing and put on the new one. I usually just use my bench vise and a socket that fits inside the bearing. A couple hits with a rubber hammer and we're ready to put the new bearing back on. You'll notice most throwout bearings have a thick flange on one side of the bearing. This will always go towards the clutch disc. And then we'll tap the new bearing on with the rubber hammer. And now we can install the splined coupler back onto the shaft and slide the shaft back onto the transmission. And then we can slide the throwout bearing carrier back onto the shaft and position it between the fork. And then we can reinstall the clutch spring. And now the moment we've been waiting for, sliding the two halves back together. As long as both halves are level and both halves are at the same height, you really shouldn't have any trouble here. Just slowly slide the two halves together and watch out for hydraulic lines or anything that might get in the way. You'll probably end up having to adjust your jack a couple times to get everything lined up just right. Once you end up with about an inch of gap, you're starting to spline the clutch shaft into the clutch disc. If you put your PTO shifter in gear and then turn your PTO shaft by hand, it'll help line up these splines. You can also use a ruler to measure the top and bottom gap to make sure you're going together straight. At this point, you're trying to get the clutch shaft splined through the clutch and also the front of the clutch shaft into the pilot bushing. These things both have to happen at the same time, so it may take a little jiggling to get everything together. No matter what you do, do not try to draw these two halves together with a bolt. You can put a bolt in there just finger tight to hold what you have, but don't try to force the two halves together. Sometimes I also like to use some light duty clamps. Again, I'm not trying to force the two halves together, I'm just putting light, steady pressure. Just keep adjusting your jack and wiggling things around, and eventually it'll all fall in place. And once it does, then you're ready to tighten up all of your bolts, put all of your parts back on, and then we can adjust the clutch pedal. You'll want to adjust your clutch so that you have about 3/4 of an inch of free travel. If you have less than 3/4 of an inch, you'll need to loosen your turnbuckle. If you have more than 3/4 of an inch, you'll want to tighten your turnbuckle. And now we're pretty well done with this project. Just remember, if you have any questions or problems, feel free to contact us. The best way is from our website, hoytractor.com. Just click on Contact Us and open a support ticket.